Hello everyone and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall STOUT. Producers around the state are seeing a lot more weeds in their pastures than normal this year. Joining us now is Daren Redfearn, our forage and pasture management specialist. And Daren, what kind of things are you seeing this year?
Well, Lyndall, what you said is true. We are actually seeing quite a few more weeds in pastures this year. A lot of that is due to the growing conditions that we had earlier in the spring, where a lot of the summer grasses did green up earlier. That also gave the weed seed a chance to germinate and also take advantage of some of the moisture and nutrients that were available to the pastures. When the pastures greened up, if you remember, it was had a little warm spell, and then the temperatures moderated enough to slow down the pastures, but then that allowed those weeds to kind of take a little foothold and go ahead and be productive. The two main problems that we saw this spring were cool season grassy weeds in warm season pastures, and then we also saw quite a number of broadleaf weeds and some of the warm season pastures. That's the problem that we're dealing with right now. Both of those problems are relatively easy to control in a normal year, but what had happened, because our summer pastures greened up so early, the weeds were able to grow a lot more rapidly. That caught a lot of us by surprise, and so a lot of the weeds weren't controlled, or if a herbicide application was made, it maybe wasn't as effective because the weeds were a little bit more mature than they normally should have been.
And we're in a pasture now that's actually been treated to some extent, but still we have some weeds and patches, and these are sort of indicative of what we're seeing around the state?
Yeah, not so much this particular type of weed. You will see this one, the Carolina horse nettle, will be growing kind of in patches like this. There's quite a bit of ragweed that's going to be scattered around the state, and I anticipate that is probably what's going to be the most problematic at this point.
Okay. Controlling, you mentioned the timing's sort of off because we got the rain and we had the mild winter. Are there some control options for these specific weeds you've mentioned at this stage in the game?
Well, it's for this particular weed, you know, because they are in patches, there are some control options. It's going to be a herbicide that has a little broader spectrum of control that may be better if it's spot applied and not applied over the entire pasture.
Daren, you've sort of termed this year the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to weeds and pastures.
Yes, if you kind of look at weeds, you know, there are three scenarios: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good part about weeds, and that's hard for a lot of people to understand, is that a lot of times weeds do have some nutritional value when they're small, and can provide some forage, if you will, to livestock when a lot of the pastures are slow growing or non-productive. Now the problem is that the weeds don't have that high quality for very long because they do mature very rapidly. At that point, the bad part kicks in, that they do utilize the moisture, they do utilize the nutrients that could be used for a lot of the forage growth. Okay, and then the ugly part of that happens when a lot of weeds, especially if they do have some toxic compounds, if the animals are forced to graze them, if a pasture's overstocked and animals run out of forage grasses and they're forced to consume the toxic weeds, and that can result in some livestock losses. Usually that's not a problem with grazed pastures that are properly stocked because there's enough forage around that the animals can pick and choose, and as the forage disappears, they're forced to consume the weeds. The other problem where they may be an issue is if a pasture that has weeds in it is harvested for hay. The animals can make an attempt to kind of pick through the forage a little bit, but a lot of times they just consume what's available. And if the weeds are toxic, there can be some potential problems occur because of that.
Okay. Are the weeds worse because a lot of pastures were overgrazed during the drought?
Yeah, that's primarily the reason we're seeing a lot of weed pressure this year, is because you got to go back to last year. The forages were not very productive anyway. You know, the animals had to graze something, so a lot of the pastures were grazed off very short, and then when the early spring green up came this year, the conditions were very appropriate, not only for the forages but also for weed seed germination.
Now, we mentioned some of the things that producers can do right now to kind of get us through the hot months, but it's really not too early to start thinking about fall and winter and sort of planning.
No, it's really not too early at all, even though we're here, you know, the end of June, early July. Normally, what we see is that by early July, about 75% of the forage production has already occurred. And as we know, during July and August in Oklahoma, it gets hot and dry, and then that's the reason that forage production slides off after that. And so, you know, more or less, unless we get a summer, I believe like 2006 was that July we had where we had so much rainfall, unless we get conditions like that, there's not a lot of soil moisture stored around across the entire state. So most of the precipitation or the moisture that's going to be available for this forage growth is going to have to occur in the form of rainfall.
Okay. And finally, as people are sort of continuing to rebound from drought and manage their pastures, you have a little bit of advice in the form of fact sheets available?
Yeah, there are a couple of fact sheets available. One of them is drought recovery in pastures, and I believe that number is PSS 2592. There's another one on there that involves a little more work, is the assessing drought damage in perennial grass pastures, and that's PSS 2593.
Okay, Daren Redfearn, thanks a lot. And for a link to those fact sheets that Daren mentioned, you can go to our website, sunup.okstate.edu.